Welcome to the final session of today's Wilkinson Lectures. My name is Navina Haider, and I'm the head of the Department of Islamic Art. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Paolo Fernando de Morais Farias, who is Honorary Professor in the Department of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Birmingham and a Fellow of the British Academy. An historian, he has worked on West African Arabic epigraphic sources dating from the 11th to the 15th century, and has also developed new approaches to the 17th century Timbuktu chronicles, as well as to some historical oral narratives of the Mande, Songhai, Batombo, and Yoruba. His Arabic medieval inscriptions from the Republic of Mali, epigraphy, chronicles, and Songhai Tuareg history, published in 2003, was a finalist for the Herskovits Award and won the Paul Heyer Prize in 2005, conferred by the USA African Studies Association. In 2017, the African Studies Association of the United Kingdom conferred on him its Distinguished Africanist Award. He had begun his academic career at the Federal University of Bahia, Brazil, and was later a research fellow at the University of Dakar, Senegal, and a lecturer in the Department of History at the Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, Nigeria. The book Landscapes, Sources, and Intellectual Projects of the West African Past, Essays in Honor of Paolo Fernando de Morais Farias, edited by Toby Green and Benedetta Rossi, was published in 2018 by Brill. We are grateful to our colleagues in the Rockefeller Wing, particularly Alisa Lagama, for creating a connection between our department's work on Africa and our department's engagement in this area, and for introducing us to the speaker, whom we warmly welcome and look forward to hearing from next. Thank you.
I'm grateful to you, Navina, and I'm grateful for this invitation to speak to this audience. At first, it was difficult for modern scholars to grasp what had happened in West Africa as Islam entered the region and took roots and prospered there. Maurice Delafosse, in the colonial period, asked the question, should one be surprised by the resistance opposed by African traditional religions to foreign conceptions, the foreign conceptions of an imported religion, which on the basis of unfamiliar notions would change from top to bottom the order of things established thousands of years ago. So he assumed that it would be a natural, necessary, inevitable conflict between the African religions and Islam. But this was not really what happened. The early Arab observers did not postulate a necessary conflict. However, they insisted on describing the relations between Muslims and others in West Africa as a duality. They described the towns where this happened as twin towns, where Muslims and others would be carefully separated from each other. But if one sees what al-Bakri and al-Muhalabi published about or wrote about Gaugao or Gao and about Ghana, which I'm showing on the screen, it is clear that this duality was not as sharp as one might think. First, the kings, rulers of these polities, combined Islamic contributions and other contributions in a very complicated, interested way. Al-Muhalabi says that the ruler of Gao pretended to be a Muslim because it was difficult to grasp from the point of view of foreign observers what was actually happening. They described it as pretending. And what was happening was something different. If de la Fosse was postulating a conflict here, a sharp division still continues to exist in the descriptions which are available to us. But it was clear, if one looks at the middle and the end of this passage on Ghana, that special, very special exceptions were made for Muslims. Rulers were prepared to alter the very ceremonial of their court in order to allow Muslims to pursue the rules of their religion. Muslims would not prostrate before another human being, only before God. So the rulers of Ghana accepted that, and Muslims were allowed simply to greet them by clapping their hands. This is a very striking concession because it goes to the very core of the ceremonial of these rulers' courts. And still, this is what happened. They allowed it. One sees how far chiefs and kings were prepared to open space where Muslims could behave according to the precepts of their religion, instead of imposing on them local rules. The imposition of local rules, which was feared by Muslim jurists in North Africa, who more than once expressed a contrary opinion about the pursuit of trade with sub-Saharan Africa, because they felt it would be impossible to lead a proper Muslim life there. But one can see here how much concession was made. Now, why all that? Because the complex societies and complex cities of the West African Sahel, even before Islam's arrival, already functioned as clusters of specialized groups and settlements, which had different occupational and cultic specializations. And exchange of goods and exchange of services was proceeded between groups that had complementary specializations. Each group had its own strong corporate identity, surrounded by firm symbolic boundaries. But, and this is a very important but, a central point, for society to work, social interchange required that different groups achieved a degree of access to each other's symbolic idioms. And as Islam arrived in a similar way, Muslim idioms would be made orally accessible to non-Muslims. And this starts the process which I might call the naturalization of Islam in West Africa. As this process proceeds, Islam is not at all, contrary to what de la Fosse thought, is not at all seen as an entirely foreign religion. Islam is one of the religions of Africa, Islam is one of the religions in that society. It was not a foreign body, a foreign intrusion. And it was not only Muslims who manned this process. The process was also advanced by the chiefs, even when they hadn't yet assumed the Muslim identity, and by other groups in society. One, and a very important one among these groups, being the responsible for the keeping of the traditions of the society, and in particular, the traditions of the kings. The oral specialists, the oral traditionists. If one adopted Delafore's view, one would have expected that oral traditionists would be among the greatest enemies of Islam, because Islam was throwing doubts on most of their traditions of origin they propagated. But yet, instead of this happening, what's happening is that Muslim repertoires of stories are communicated to these non-Muslims who begin to borrow from them in stories of their own, which reinforces and advances the process of naturalization I'm talking about. Now, Muslims themselves, they brought in their mind, in their set of ideas, a binary template in which the greatest distinction was a distinction between Muslims and infidels. And this is very well expressed, of course, in the famous Surah Al-Kafirun, which ends by saying, "To you be your way, and to me mine." But the Surah Al-Kafirun itself is not only a vehicle of rejection of all other cultic attitudes, it opens a space for coexistence and even cooperation, as it had happened in Arabia itself at the time of the so-called Covenant of Medina, when Prophet Muhammad and his Meccan followers moved to Medina and established a pact with the people there, including initially Jews. And these Jews were declared one community with the believers. To the Jews, their own religion, and to the Muslims, their own way, their own religion. But the Jews of Medina, they were people following another scriptural religion. They were people of the book. In the case of West Africa, what we have is an experiment that goes farther than this. It is cooperation with people who did not have any scriptural religion. But in the 18th and 19th century, as jihad movements developed in West Africa, enforcing the creation of polities where Islamic law was Islamic, the law of the land. In spite of this, the knowledge that the history that had made all this possible had been a history of cooperation across the divide between Muslims and infidels, and even to the extent of living under the government of infidels was there. This is very clear when another episode of history took place in Sokoto. The Sokoto, the capital of the caliphate of the same name, was conquered by the British in 1903. And the alternative was to leave the city so as not to have to live under British government, or to stay and accept to live under that government. Hijra was no longer an option in that context. So the Wazir of Sokoto sent a message to other Muslim scholars in which he cites the Alcalin of Gwandu, which says what is being shown by my screen at the moment, that sitting together, having social intercourse with non-Muslims, with al-kuffār, was not unbelief. And surely, for a long time, this is what exactly had been done by Muslims in all West Africa. And no one was adjudged to be an unbeliever for such social intercourse or for being under the government of the kuffār. And this is very important because Gwandu was a city known as the center of those who took the most purest view regarding the Sokoto Jihad, those who insisted the most on following the most strict precepts of Islamic law. And yet, at the time the British take Sokoto, that is the opinion the Alcalin of Gwandu gives. And he cites, to support his opinion, a man, the brother of Danfodio, Abdullahi Danfodio, who had written a little before the jihad that living among the kuffār, as they all had done, is nothing akin to unbelief. And to justify that, he alludes to Surah Al-Kafirun, to them a religion, to us the religion of the chosen prophet. So we see that this use of the Surah Al-Kafirun is something that crosses from the beginning to the end of this long period of several centuries, from the very beginning of the arrival of Islam to the time of the great jihads of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Now, very important in all this is the fact that Islam arrived in West Africa not as something brought by conquering Muslim armies, conquering foreign Muslim armies, as it had happened in North Africa itself or in Spain. It was brought in by traders. And we see the network of routes that allowed this to happen. All these contacts with Egypt on the one hand, North Africa, of course, and with Al-Andalus, the Muslim Spain, on the other. But what this map does not show is what we could call the other half of the story, which is the network of trading routes that grew within West Africa itself. But to to understand how this network of routes of trade, which were also roots of propagation of Islam, how they were born, and what kind of people traveled along them. And we have to think, of course, in the first place, of Muslim traders and Muslim scholars, Muslim teachers. But there were two other very important diasporas that helped in the propagation of Islam, which also traveled along these routes. One was the warriors on horseback, and the other was oral traditionists who migrated. West Africa is a region of great migrations, of great movements of people. And without concentrating our attention on these movements, we cannot understand how Islam got a hold there. And I am simplifying. I'm not talking about all the great migrations. I'm not talking about migration of fisher folk along the river Niger, for instance. I'm not talking about the migration of Fulani herds people who moved from the west all the way towards the region of Lake Chad. But I shall concentrate on warriors, oral traditionists, and traders and teachers. Here is an image of an equestrian, a man who seems well equipped for war. And it is difficult to imagine such a figure as somebody who is at the same time an agent, if not of the propagation, an agent of the naturalization of Islam in the region. Here is another one with a shield, and again, the same difficult assaults our imagination. These warriors on horseback, they traveled long distances. Some of them, Manding warriors, came from Mali and advanced to establish a polity here in Kuchia. Here is Kuchia on the Niger Valley. And at the same time created there the dynasty historians know as the Soni or Si dynasty, which were the initiators of Songhai as a conquering empire in West Africa. But they did not travel only in this direction. They traveled in other directions, sometimes much farther south. Here is Gonja, another polity founded by such warriors in the mid-16th century of the Common Era. And an interesting thing is that the association between warriors and specialists of Islam, Islamic teachers, Islamic scholars, was there from the beginning. The traditions of Gonja were set out in writing in Arabic in the following centuries. And there is a passage in the beginning of one of these kitabs which says, if you want to wage a war and you do not find a Muslim scholar, then it is impossible for you to do so. It is very clear that far from seeing Muslims as a potential challenge to their authority, on the contrary, these rulers saw the Muslims as a resource who could be drawn upon to support their own power. If we go back to Bentia Kutia, where the Sunni were, here we find the same association between Islam and warriors. As I said, Kutia became a military capital from which a series of great conquering wars took place. But it was also the place where an important Muslim community was established. They were traders and they practiced, they produced funerary inscriptions. And one of them, there is an inscription for a wazir, for a minister, and there is an inscription, this one I'm showing now, for a preacher of the khutbah, of the sermon in the communal Friday prayer, which shows that there must have been a big mosque there. And also, usually, it is in the khutbah, in this sermon, that people pronounce their acceptance of the legitimacy of the ruler of the place. So again, we see there that Muslims saw the chiefs as protectors, and the chiefs saw the Muslims as a resource from which they could draw for their own authority, in favor of their own authority. Now, another very interesting point is that though epigraphy, though the making of inscriptions follows very well this advance of Islam down the Niger towards the south to Kuchia and beyond, the chronicles of Timbuktu are totally unaware of the existence of Muslims producing inscriptions in Kuchia. The chronicles of Timbuktu don't mention inscriptions neither at Kuchia or further north in Gao. Timbuktu had and has an approach, a historical approach to Islam, which is different from all that. The great 17th century Timbuktu chronicle, Tariq al-Sudan, says with great pride that the cult of idols had never been practiced in Timbuktu, that nobody in Timbuktu had prostrated except before God, never before idols. So Timbuktu is a different kind of Islam. And Timbuktu is most justifiably a focus of interest of anybody who studies Islam in West Africa. But Timbuktu is the Islam of literacy. It is the Islam that developed in circumstances different from what I'm talking about. So it is necessary to, if we want to get the whole picture, to remember that it is necessary to study Timbuktu, but also to search for other tools of investigation that allow us to go beyond what the vision of Timbuktu, the vision from Timbuktu allows us to see. And so I'm saying that because I want to insist that the propagation of Islam is not only the propagation of the religion conducted by Muslims. It also depends on this more general naturalization of Islam as an African religion, which was performed by chiefs and by oral traditionists. This is the translation of the inscription I have just shown. You can see very clearly the date. It is early 15th century of the Common Era. Now I turn to oral traditionists, to specialists of the oral, of the spoken word. And on one hand, one side, I show Wa Kamisoko, who was a traditionist I knew very well, here photographed by Jean Rouch in 1976, the very year when he died. And on the other side is Alhaji, that is to say, an Alhaj, the man who had performed the pilgrimage, an Arokin of Oyo in Yoruba land, also photographed in this case by myself. Now, in the repertoire of Wa Kamisoko, one had a very interesting coexistence of alternative stories of origin for the kings of Mali. On the one hand, the traditional stories about Sundiata and his rival, his opponent, Sumanguru, Sumaoro, which do not depend on Islam and can be told, can be recited, can be sung in a way totally independent from Islam. But he also had other stories in which the kings of Mali found ancestors in Arabia. A very noted Malian sociologist, Professor Yusuf Tatasese, who was a great friend and collaborator of Wa Kamisoko, was intrigued by that. So when he published a series of narratives produced by Wa, he made a point of treating those which were couched in the idiom of Islam apart. He put all of them in a separate appendix and maintained only the other stories that didn't make reference to Islam in the body of the book. It is an old idea of authenticity, of African authenticity, which denies the possibility that what is in Islamic idiom can be treated as having the same degree of African authenticity as that which does not use Islamic themes, Islamic repertoires. Also, Krina, the place where Wa Kamisoko was born, continued in the 70s to be a center of a cult, a totally non-Islamic cult, a cult of the Krina Kono, the bird of Krina, which is a bird figure that has an important role in the traditions about Sundiata of Mali that are totally separate, independent from Islam. Now, Wa himself was a Muslim, but in this very village, there was this cult, the high priest of which was forbidden to pray. He could not be a Muslim. Wa, of course, was himself a Muslim. Now, this kind of setting things side by side, as if they could be somehow treated in the same way, was, in my view, and that is what I argue for, a very important step on establishing Islam as a local religion. Islam was not something foreign. You had stories which were constructed from Islamic repertoires. You had other stories which were totally independent from it. But from the beginning, this was a way of retaining the functionality of those societies. Muslims were now one of the native groups of the society. So stories associated with the religion practiced by that group were part of what we would today call the national stories. They were not something apart, something like a small religion or a small minority. They were central to the body politics. They were central to the body culture. Now, these traditionists, they migrated, as I have intimated before. They were from Mali, and from even further west than Mali, from the lands of the Soninke lands of the old polity, the Arabs called Ghana. They went to Gao, and from Gao, they came down the Niger. In all these regions, you find oral traditionists who, to this day, they recite their narratives, their cantics, not in the local languages, which are different dialects of the great Songhai language. They recited in Soninke, the language of old Ghana. And they brought this all the way down to Busa, and especially to places like Niki. Both Niki and Busa are part of this cluster of states, which we call the Busa, the Borgu states. And not only their influence, the influence of their ideas didn't stop there. It was communicated to the Yoruba living further south. Here is Oyo. Here is Oyo Ile, the old abandoned capital, abandoned in the 1830s. And this is New Oyo, the city of the traditionists I showed before, and which I had the good fortune of being able to photograph. Now, during the period of greatest power of Sokoto controlled a region that extended over a vast territory. And it was a threat both to Oyo and to Busa and Niki and the Borgu states in general. So in that era, a very important new theme that may have been developed for the first time in that period was the construction of the Niger, of the river Niger, as a symbolic, not only a geographical barrier, but a symbolic barrier between lands to the east of it, lands to the west of it, and more clearly symbolic yet still, a separation between what belonged to Mecca and what belonged to the polities west of the Niger, where the rulers were at the time not Muslim, had not adopted Islam, but where important Muslim communities lived. And in order to do so, particular stories and rituals were developed. I'm showing these boo-boos just to remind us. Here are some of the Wangara. The name Wangara is the name of one of the great corporation of Muslim traders, the routes through which they traveled along these regions. And here, the tablets that symbolize the emphasis on education that they had, and which made possible for Muslims to keep their distinctive, separate identity, separate ideologically, but not socially. And an important codification of these relations with unbelievers along these trade routes is attributed to a scholar called Al-Hajj Salim Swari, which is particularly associated with the Jula and Jahanke, that are the two Muslim networks of trade and Islamic teaching that are at the very western extreme of the Mande-speaking networks. And central to this codification was no active proselytization, no systematic attempt to preach in order to convert people, acceptance of the authority of non-Muslim rulers insofar as they preserved the Muslims' own freedom to practice the religion of the Quran. No recourse to arms against non-Muslim rulers except in self-defense. A extremely emphatic commitment to Islamic education and Islamic law, and presenting the unbelievers with an example to be emulated. It was this that, in their view, would eventually break their ignorance, which was the source of their unbelief, and allows them finally to convert. Now, all these traders and oral traditioners and teachers traveling, migrating, contributed to the creation of these narratives about the Niger. The Niger, originally a narrow stream, was miraculously enlarged by Kisra. Kisra, of course, being Khosrau, a dynasty of Persia, was recorded, as we know, in Muslim lore and Muslim literature, and which was brought to West Africa and emerges in the context of the creation of these new narratives. Busa kings were not allowed to sail on the Niger or cross it or even drink water from it. And every year, at the time of the greatest Muslim festival, the king of Busa prayed as a Muslim. Soon afterwards, however, he would gallop around for some time, spear in hand, demanding to know who had caused him to pray and announcing he would now wage war on Islam. The following year, the same thing would be repeated. So there was a dynamic of reiterated affirmations of Islam by praying and negations of Islam by claiming to start a war against Mecca. So the result of that was an impasse, a symbolic impasse. The rulers could neither be entirely Muslim, nor could they be in conflict with Islam. They had somehow to be in a different position. There are a similar series of narratives appears among the Yoruba. Oduduwa claimed to be the son of Namurudu, who is, of course, Nimrud. He is forced to leave Mecca, establishes himself in Ile-Ife. There, his descendants worship an Orisha, a deity, but also a copy of the Quran, bound up a sacred relic. So the Quran in this case is on the one hand negated as verbal message. On the other hand, it is treated as a sacred relic, as a sacred object. Again, an apparently impossible position, but this impossibility is actually what made possible the presence and the cooperation between Muslim and non-Muslims in those societies. Was part of this process of naturalization of Islam I have been trying to talk about. And Oduduwa's grandson, Oramiyan, decides to wage war on Mecca, but he is unable to cross the Niger and has to abandon the project. So he takes counsel with a Bogu king, and he establishes a new capital. Actually, what basically prevents him from advancing towards Mecca is a column of ants, a kind of metaphorical river of ants, a kind of animal duplication of the barrier constituted by the Niger. But the point was that a limit had to be established between Islam and other cults. But it was this limit that preserved free space for Islam. And it was within that space that Islam could grow, as indeed it grew. In 1910, the king of Busa, one of the Bogu states, received a letter from a German elephant hunter and replied to it saying, unfortunately, the story of Kisra, my ancestor, is a very old story. He says that here at the end of this leaflet and at the beginning here. But he says actually, I don't know about it, but he enclosed with his letter a longish note written by the Muslims of his court, in which one of the many versions of the Kisra story, Kisra as ancestor of the rulers of Bogu, is told. So it is very clear to me that those who had the means of production of such narratives were the Muslims themselves. Nevertheless, some observers have seen the Kisra narrative as simply an anti-Islamic narrative, when in fact it is not. It can only have been produced by the very Muslims some people think it was produced against. So that is, to me, the point where I would like to stop. It is. I go up to the point where the naturalization of Islam seems to be absolutely clear and spread over practically the whole of West Africa. Thank you very much.